everyone. I guess West Coast folks, good morning. Great to have everyone here today. My name's Miriam Rollin, and I'm attorney and director of the Education Civil Rights Alliance, which is a national network of advocates for marginalized children's education civil rights, and it's convened through the National Center for Youth Law out in Oakland. I'm thrilled today to be moderating this timely session entitled Back to School in the Time of COVID-19, Civil Rights Implications as Children Return to School. Sponsored by the ABA section on civil rights and social justice, this panel is one of many in a series of rapid response webinars. The section is actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please do visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on the programs. Before we begin this session, I want to center our discussion today on the fact that this is today the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington, during which participants heard from many civil rights luminaries, including A. Philip Randolph, Mrs. Medgar Evers, John Lewis, James Farmer, Roy Wilkins, and of course, the iconic Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Obviously, we cannot hope today to match the power of those speakers, but may each of us too make some good trouble on these issues, and may we not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I'm honored to begin today by introducing Patricia Lee Rito, the president of the American Bar Association and a partner at Snell and Wilmer, for a few opening remarks. President Rito.
Thank you, Miriam, and I'm delighted to be with you today. Thank you to you and to all of our panelists for the really important and timely webinar. And I got to give a particular shout out to one of our panelists who will be joining us shortly, the president-elect of the American Bar Association, Reggie Turner, who's been a leader in the ABA and in our profession for years and years, particularly on issues of educational justice and justice for children. He's going to be an outstanding ABA president a year from now, not just yet, but a year from now. And we look, of course, forward to that leadership. Let me also thank the section on civil rights and social justice for producing this and so many other really outstanding programs, publications, and other activities, not just in the rapid response series that you referenced, but in so many other areas critical to justice in our communities. We have to keep the issues of civil rights and social justice at the forefront of our profession as we advocate for a more just world and work to make a difference in people's lives. Pursuing justice and delivering justice is the chief creed of the legal profession and the mission of the American Bar Association. Membership in the ABA is critical as we carry out the work to represent the legal profession and to promote justice and the rule of law. So if you're an ABA member, please know that your support makes a difference. And if you're not an ABA member, I hope you will visit our website and consider all of the benefits that we have to offer and the resources for your practice, your career, and frankly, your awareness of the issues of justice and how you can participate in our work. Everyone who is part of this webinar today knows the depth and breadth of the challenges that our nation faces. How can we respond? How can we make a difference? The answer I'm going to suggest in a way is quite simple. Get to work. Do something. John Lewis had a great way to express it in a slightly different context. He used to say, when you pray, move your feet. And I love that because it is yet another way to remind us that what we do is what matters. And what lawyers have always done is to get busy to solve problems and challenges. That is the core of who we are as lawyers. And the American Bar Association is the largest voluntary association of lawyers in the world. So let's get to work. Your participation in this webinar brings important issues to light and informs us what we need to do, both as lawyers and as citizens. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for the important work that you do. And thank you for the support that you provide to ensure that our profession meets America's promise of justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trish. Really wonderful remarks. And thank you to the ABA for hosting this session today. Just two housekeeping notes before we go further. In today's program, we will address questions towards the end of the panel. We encourage you to ask questions of panelists through the Q&A function. Please do not use the chat function for that purpose. Feel free to make comments on the chat function, but for questions, please use the Q&A. If you have questions about how to find that, if you scroll down towards the bottom of your window, your Zoom window, you should be able to see both chat and Q&A. Afterwards, we'll be sharing a recording of this program for everyone who has registered so that you can share it widely with your networks as well. With that, I am thrilled to bring you today's program, Back to School in the Time of COVID-19, Civil Rights Implications as Children Return to School. For too many children who are marginalized because of their race, national origin, first language, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, or experience with homelessness, foster care, juvenile justice, etc. Inequities in education predated COVID, but many of those inequities have been made both more apparent and exacerbated in the COVID environment. As the focus of the media in terms of school reopening has largely been, is it physical opening? Is it remote learning? Is it some hybrid of the two? There has been inadequate focus on the inequities in education for marginalized children in the time of COVID. And that's why we have this panel today. To dig into these issues, I'll introduce each of our 5 panelists, give them an opportunity for opening remarks, and then I'll ask some questions and we'll have a discussion. I am very honored to introduce our first panelist, Reginald Turner, the American Bar Association's president-elect and a partner at Clark Hill. He's held many positions in the ABA and outside the ABA. Perhaps most relevant to today's discussion, he's a past chair of the ABA Commission on Racial and Ethnic Diversity in the profession and of the Commission on the Lawyer's Role in Assuring Every Child a Quality Education. He's also active in the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, a wonderful member organization of the Education Civil Rights Alliance. Reggie, I look forward to having you share some opening thoughts about every child's right to a high quality education and the lawyer's role in ensuring that.
Thank you very much, Miriam. It's my pleasure to be here, and I want to thank all of you for your interest in this very important topic. Needless to say, the young people in our nation are the future of our nation. And it is in our personal interest and of course in our interest as officers of the court, of leaders in our community, to ensure that we are running a K-12 educational system that meets the needs of all students across our great nation. Any discussion about safely opening K-12 schools in America in this time of COVID must start with the basic premise that every child has a right to a high quality education. The ABA has repeatedly enacted policies underscoring lawyers' indispensable role in the effort to ensure that each child gets a high quality education. A decade ago, the ABA adopted 3 sets of recommendations on the right to high quality education and encouraged attorneys to to work with their school communities to promote the right of all students to receive the benefits of education. Since then, the ABA has reaffirmed those recommendations, including in the ABA Presidential Commission on the lawyer's role in assuring every child's right to a high quality education, which I chaired for President Linda Klein in 2017. The first set of ABA recommendations calls for federal, state, and local action to spell out core elements of quality education and to ensure that all schools provide those elements to every child and to implement and enforce existing provisions of law targeted at enabling students and parents to effectuate their rights and to participate fully in decisions affecting those rights. A second recommendation is aimed at securing the right to remain in school. Far too often, children, particularly children in poverty, are expelled from school, and needless to say, learning stops in many cases when children aren't even given the opportunity to sit in the classroom in order to get their lessons and to interact with their fellow students and teachers. We have to build an educational system that supports the needs of children rather than segregating those children who are having problems in school. We have to seek to reduce the removal of students from instruction as a result of disciplinary exclusion or police and court referral in response to school-related behavior. The third recommendation seeks to secure for all youth who have left or been excluded from school or are incarcerated the right to resume their education in a high-quality, age-appropriate program that enables them to graduate and prepare for higher education. The Education Committee of the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section has worked to determine if citizens across the country have any common agreement on the essential elements of a high-quality education, and to see if most citizens agreed that a high-quality education is a fundamental right, essential to the functioning of our democratic form of government. In 2017, the committee solicited and received reports from 12 focus groups around the country. The findings of these focus groups were compiled in an Education Bill of Rights produced by the committee and the section. The Bill of Rights contains information and insights on proper funding, adequate curriculum, addressing the needs of the whole child, qualified teachers, alternatives to traditional education, parent, student, and community involvement, restorative justice instead of traditional discipline, pre-K education, and the need for supportive administrations. Lawyers can and should be involved in these issues. Education is an important issue for the bar because of our commitment to eliminate bias and enhance diversity in our profession and in the justice system. To meet this critical goal, we must look at the root causes of societal problems so we can best nurture our children's capabilities. More than 60 years ago, lawyers played a major role in securing education on an equal basis in Brown versus Board of Education. Yet despite the efforts of pro bono and public interest lawyers, we're still a long way away from fully securing the basic right of an adequate education for all children, particularly those with low-income families, children of color, children with disabilities, and others from at-risk environments. The problem is particularly acute in the school-to-prison pipeline, in which disadvantaged students, especially those who need special attention or social assistance, are often neglected. Minority students are disproportionately represented in this population as they often attend failing schools, are subject to zero-tolerance discipline policies, and drop out in high numbers if they're not suspended or expelled first. Many come from families where there has been generational involvement with the criminal justice system. And they are often categorized on the basis of that kind of history and not given the opportunity to succeed fully with respect to their educational opportunities. These are civil rights and economic issues. Students who leave school prematurely frequently are disengaged as citizens, lose earning capacity, become more dependent upon public programs, and eventually many join the prison population. Nobel laureate James Heckman of the American Bar Foundation has documented the benefits of high quality early childhood education as the most economical prevention of these ills. Through personal involvement and engagement in their local public schools, whether as interested members of the community or members of school boards, lawyers can use readily available data to determine whether their state and local school districts are delivering high quality education. Lawyers can identify, measure, and evaluate gaps, help experts develop plans to close them, and advocate privately and publicly for the needed reforms and funding, and where necessary, seek the assistance of the judiciary. I'm proud of the ABA and my involvement in these issues, and I hope that all of you continue your interest in this subject. And of course, please feel free to reach out to me at any time when you feel as though I can be of assistance to you in your work or in assistance to you as we move the ABA forward on this very, very important issue that faces our nation today and will continue to face our nation for time to come. With that, I'll be happy to answer any questions that any of you have.
Great. Thank you so much, Reggie. I think what we'll do is we'll give everyone a chance to kind of do a little bit of an opening on the panel, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. But thank you so much for your remarks, really painting a picture both of many challenges facing marginalized students in our education system at any time. And certainly those are more acute during the time of COVID. So thank you so much. Our next speakers that I'll introduce are from the Learning Policy Institute. Abby Schachner is a senior researcher at LPI, and she's co-author of the new report that I think you'll hear a little bit about in their remarks. It's called Restarting and Reinventing School: Learning in the Time of COVID and Beyond. It's hot off the presses, so looking forward to hearing more about that. Abby holds a PhD in human development, and her work focuses on translating research on children's social, emotional, and academic development to inform policy and practice. She's joined by Adam Edgerton, who's also a senior researcher at LPI and is co-author of that report you'll hear more about, along with Abby and Linda Darling-Hammond, of course, and a team of LPI researchers. Adam holds a PhD as well, but his is in education policy, and he specializes in studying the implementation of K-12 standards in English and math, accountability policies under the Every Student Succeeds Act, and collective bargaining issues. Abby and Adam, tell us a little bit about what you both see and what your report talks about as being major issues in restarting school that most implicate equity and student civil rights in this COVID environment.
Thank you, Miriam. First, I'll just say that for people who aren't familiar, the Learning Policy Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan and policy think tank founded by Linda Darling-Hammond. And a lot of us are former educators, and we are trying to inform education policy and practice from early childhood up through college and career readiness. And the report that we just released identifies 10 research-based priorities, and these are targeted at both policymakers and educators. And they're grounded in notions of equity and effective teaching and learning, regardless of whether schools are open or not for in-person learning. And we know that the most important foundational structural issue for learning to happen this fall is to close the digital divide. So that's our first priority. We know based on census data that roughly 30% of the 50 million K-12 students in the United States do not have either high-speed internet or the device they need to connect to the internet. And we know also that students from low-income homes, based on a survey done by Parents Together, are nearly 10 times more likely to say that their children were not doing remote learning at home. And so we know that these are huge gaps, and people are still struggling to figure out how to make sure that every child has internet and an internet connected device. And we know that these gaps disproportionately impact students of color and students from low-income families and students in rural communities. But the report points out success stories of states that have done this, have bridged the divide, have been spending years ensuring that there's rural broadband access as well as urban broadband access. And so we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A. Another major issue that we're seeing as people implement blended learning models are attendance. And lots of places are interpreting attendance as making sure that students are in front of a computer for 5 to 6 hours a day. And we show how state legislatures, districts can implement different policies that allow for us to measure learning based on competency and engagement, that will kind of take some of the pressure off of trying to have a kindergartner sit still for 5 to 6 hours, you know, which is really terrible. And finally, before I turn it over to Abby, we talk about how we can create authentic assessments to get away from the idea that we are going to implement the standardized assessments as usual and use those to make decisions, but instead to create tests, performance tasks, other activities that students can do and that can be used for accountability purposes so that students are engaged and involved in their learning.
Great. Thanks, Adam. And really happy to be here. Some additional threats to equity that we've highlighted are when we're thinking about the way in which children are being grouped, whether that's through hybrid schedules or through creating smaller learning communities. There's a lot of good potential for promoting better relationships by having those small groups, but there's also the potential to reintroduce tracking and segregation, somewhat unknowingly or unintentionally, potentially, if the groups are grouped based upon ability, or using diagnostic assessment tests to kind of determine where children are performing relative to age or grade level expectations and using that to drive the groupings rather than intentionally creating inclusive groups across lines of difference that allow kids to interact with each other and learn from one another. And relatedly, another threat to equity that we've been seeing is the emergence of the private home learning pods that are really being clustered within wealthy neighborhoods, largely formed by well-resourced families to supplement distance or hybrid learning, which have the potential to further exacerbate inequities and segregation. So we think that school districts have a role to play into helping coordinate and connect parents to help promote more diverse groupings of pods, and also in working with community partners to leverage community spaces to provide spaces for doing remote learning and having some of those smaller learning opportunities happen. And we'll provide some examples of that. And then another kind of big piece that we see is that we know that the pandemic has been disruptive for all children and all families, but we know that it's most pronounced for those who are historically underserved, and also given all of the racial violence and discord that's happening, particularly for communities of color, this added kind of pandemic happening within this other pandemic that is really, you know, exacerbating inequities. And so there's a growing awareness and appreciation for the importance of social emotional learning and responding to the stress and the trauma that children are experiencing, which is great. But there are also some concerns if it's not done thoughtfully, that some iterations of social emotional learning supports could actually step into some equity pitfalls and end up undermining student expression and kind of become another form of policing of student behavior and expression in ways that are culturally insensitive. So that's something else that we want to be aware of. And we have some resources and strategies we can also share for trying to help avoid some of those equity pitfalls. And then the last piece is just that educators need to be prepared in order to make all of these shifts and respond to that moment. So using funding strategically and investing strategically and prioritizing those areas for preparing educators is going to be really critical, as well as thinking about this moment as an opportunity to make shifts potentially to school funding formulas to be more equitably distributed. There are several examples of states that did this during the recession when there weren't funds flowing in, and it can actually be a time that you can make changes that won't actually go into effect until more money flows in, and it can actually be easier to make those changes when there aren't dollars at stake at the moment. So that's another piece where there's a potential to put into place change now that could be better and longer standing down the road. And those are the ones that we wanted to just highlight to start with. And then we definitely have lots of other examples and resources we can share once we open it up for Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Abby and Adam. Really helpful information. And the report is terrific. I think that will be, the link will be shared with you all. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Megan Stanton Trahan. She is adjunct professor and also director of the Youth Justice Education Clinic at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. She represents system-involved youth in special education, school discipline, and other school-related proceedings. She's also engaged in various policy initiatives to promote equity and positive educational outcomes for system-involved youth throughout California and in LA County in particular. Megan, can you tell us about some of the biggest challenges that system-involved youth in particular and students with disabilities have faced thus far in COVID-19?
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you to the ABA for putting on this webinar. I'm pleased to be with you all today. So, of course, I have to begin any remarks by talking about some of my clients and sharing their stories with you, because they, as you know, we've all been talking today about great solutions. I just have to put them up front and center into any conversation. So as Miriam mentioned, I represent system-involved young people. So I'm going to tell you a couple of brief stories of how the pandemic impacted two of my clients. One of them is a young person who was detained in a juvenile hall during this time, and another one is a young person who is out in the community trying to access support and services. So I'll start with Marco. He is a young man who has been in and out of juvenile detention in Los Angeles County for the last 2 years, and he has struggled with obtaining special education services. He has various disabilities, actually, intellectual disability, speech and language impairment, as well as other health impairment. And, unfortunately for Marco, when the pandemic hit, he was detained. And, we, as his attorneys, were in constant contact to see what was happening, how he was accessing services inside. Of course, just like every school, schools and the detention facilities were closed in the beginning of the pandemic, and really were struggling to sort of shift and figure out how to provide services. But for Marco, this was really challenging. He was cut off from everybody, and he really liked school and wanted to keep going and didn't know what was going on. So he had a lot of trouble, completing the packet work that he was given. So basically he was provided homework packets to do sort of in his unit by himself, and didn't have any access to a special education teacher at that time, or his school counselor or his speech and language therapist. And so he had a lot of trouble. he may have talked to a few people on the phone, but he really wasn't sure how that was going to help him complete the work in front of him. So that was something that he was really struggling with. And then finally, when things started to, open up and they started opening classrooms in a socially distanced manner, and getting access to technology in the juvenile hall, he had trouble adjusting to that new norm as well, because he had been sort of doing these packets for a month and a half, 2 months, and not receiving his special education services either. And then, what we tried to do is make sure that he got access to people in person instruction as much as possible, so that he had that real-time interaction to help him. Given his various disabilities, that was really the only thing that we could get to work for him. Of course, it wasn't perfect, but it was something that was really important for Marco. And then, he luckily has been released into the community since COVID-19 has been continuing on, and the transition outside has been challenging, but we're working through it. He has a lot of support, but that reentry process is really hard right now during COVID-19 for students, because the systems are all different, how we enroll in school, how we get access to the new school district, how we sort of change over services and supports. That is an area of need for him and for all of my clients who are detained and being released. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about Jake. He's a client of mine who, unfortunately, during COVID-19, or right before, sort of in that time period, he and his family became homeless. And of course, in California and Los Angeles in particular, homelessness was a problem before the pandemic, but now it's exacerbated, of course. So Jake became homeless and had to double up, move in with family somewhere else in Los Angeles. He had a really hard time getting access to technology from his school of origin. His family wanted him to stay there because they really hoped to go back and be able to re-enroll him there when schools open in person. So they wanted him to have that continuity. But it was really challenging for them to get physically to the school, to pick up the laptop and the Wi-Fi hotspot, because it was maybe an hour and a half away from where they were staying. So he actually missed out on at least 2 months of school because he couldn't pick up his laptop. And we worked with the school, finally figured out a solution, but unfortunately he ended up failing his classes. So what we see from both of these cases is, for Marco, he didn't get access to his special education services and really missed out on at least a few months of schooling and services that could have really benefited him. And for Jake, the same thing. He missed out on months worth of education during this time period. So what do we do for them now and in the future to help address some of these challenges? I would say, unfortunately, in California and in LA County right now, not much has changed in terms of, schools are not reopening physically. We're still in this distance learning environment. So we're still trying to advocate for the best supports and services we can in that atmosphere. But what we've been doing and what we would recommend to anybody that, is engaging in advocacy for young people is to ask school districts to have distance learning IEPs. So, schedule a meeting, figure out what is and isn't working for the young person and their family during this time period. Of course, we would love to see students continue to get the exact same services as before, but we're also cognizant of the fact that maybe there needs to be changes, and let's figure out what needs to change. Maybe we need to increase something or decrease something. Maybe the parents actually need more support. We've had clients whose parents or education rights holders are grandparents taking care of them. They may need assistance on how to use technology. So those kind of things could be discussed and implemented in a distance learning IEP. We also, as advocates, have been working with schools to discuss how we will implement compensatory services for students, because schools understand and know that these students have missed out on months worth of education in some cases. And they understand that, and they're willing to work with us to provide us with a solution for how we make up for that in the future for them. And so we've been lucky to get service logs for our clients and try to work on those kind of solutions moving forward. Of course, that's an individual case-by-case basis. So that's another challenge that I'd highlight as something that, could use advocacy on a more systemic level. What do we do for all of these young people who maybe don't have a parent or an advocate that's saying we need compensatory services here? And then, of course, making sure that our clients have technology. That is number one. Abby and Adam talked about that. This is it was a huge problem before the pandemic, the digital divide. It continues to be so. For many of my clients, especially those who are system involved, checking out a computer and signing a form that they're going to be liable for it is a huge impediment. So we need to make those technology devices, not a checkout loan process, like especially for these clients that are living in places that maybe not safe. They're not going to check them out because they don't believe that they can return them, and they don't want to be liable for that or get in trouble. So that's a big thing as well. The last thing I would say, and this is not necessarily based on individual client advocacy, but I would say there's power in numbers. So what I would recommend, and what we've been doing in LA and statewide in California, is working with our partners and other advocacy organizations, community organizers, to talk to youth and families and get together and come up with collective solutions. So we can work with schools and districts in the area to try to work together as a group and think collectively, because we're all in this together, and we need to make sure that all of our young people, especially those most vulnerable, are going to be, moving through and come out the other end of this not even farther behind than they were before. So I'll end there, pass it on. Happy to answer more questions at the end.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. And, really the powerful stories of your clients, it provides a level of reality to this discussion about issues that I think is so important for folks to really understand it, not only in their heads, but in their hearts, which really is what generates action. So thank you so much, Megan, for adding that contextual, important contextual information. It is now my honor and pleasure to introduce our next and final panelist, Lydia Templeton. She is a missionary and a pro bono attorney, and she is also the CEO and founder of the Children, Youth, and Family Collaborative, which is an education program, and she'll tell you a little more about it. It's on the campuses of 35 schools throughout LA County, and it serves and does an amazing job of increasing the graduation rates of foster youth in the county. So Lydia, can you tell us about some of the educational challenges experienced by foster youth during COVID and how your program helps address some of those challenges?
Sure, have to unmute first. Thank you, Miriam, and the ABA for this vital webinar. A little bit about our program. It serves foster youth, and this is the introduction to meeting the needs of a marginalized population Reginald Turner spoke about earlier, and supporting youth as they return to school in the midst of COVID-19. Now let's put this in context a little bit. Nationally, less than 50% of the youth in foster care graduate from high school. And in California, in 2018, 56% of the foster youth graduated from high school, compared to 85% of non-foster youth. 74% of the prison population in California have spent time in foster care. So in 1999, we launched at one site serving 25 foster youth. The site had the most foster youth in Los Angeles County. And to date, that the agency has served about 10,000 foster youth with an 80 to 100% graduation rate. How do you do it, you might ask? Well, we implement something called the Academic Remediation Intervention Support Services Education Program Model. Our program is on the school campuses, which is a non-negotiable, and youth must be able to find this program. So we have a dedicated classroom, a full-time employee with a caseload of 25 foster youth. There are three major components. There's the relationship-based academic remediation and intervention, which you can say is tutoring plus. And the relationship is critical because you can't provide services to system-involved youth without having that relationship. Our staff may be seen as like the surrogate big brothers or big sisters. And this is an intentional process and protocol to establishing relationships with our foster youth, because being authentic and working with youth in the system is very critical. We provide tutoring, homework assistance, skills deficit training, and push in, push out services, and we're able to do that even in distance learning. We were able to transform our services from being in person to online within 1 week of the school's closing. The second component is our academic case management. We use a tool that's known as an individualized service plan. And this document is developed with youth participation and all the stakeholders. In order to assist our youth in foster care, it is important that the services are individualized. This is not a cookie cutter program. We monitor attendance, we monitor the academic progress, we develop goals together and tailor it to the individual youth, and work closely with every teacher on campus and everyone in the child's life. And our real concept is that a village, is that we must be a part of that school, because it does take a village to work with the students and to be accessible to the students so they can find us on the campus. Our third and final component of the program is coordinating that support for youth. We're not the panacea, but we believe in partnerships and collaboration. Those are critical factors in this program model. The professionals who are assigned to the school sites are responsible for implementing this program, and we call them essential workers. They are known also as youth education specialists, which means yes, they must be a college graduate, have tutoring experience, successfully pass a competency exam, and attend a 40-hour training institute on the program model. And annually, we recertify our employees on implementing this program. This youth education specialist is critical because our children don't have someone in their lives consistently who is serving as their mentor, friend, tutor, advocate, ambassador, case manager, almost like a surrogate parent in that child's life at the school. This is a holistic model for student success. When I was in school, my father advocated for me, and I recognized that at a critical point when there was a teacher giving me a lot of problems in the school, and it was a personality, I think, conflict at the time, but I was a child. My father came in and advocated for me. That's what we do for our children. We're their advocates on campus. We're their surrogates. And it's important that our staff understands how to implement that. We have benchmark meetings, professional development, and staff wellness workshops, because we have to care for the parents, surrogate parents, who are taking care of our foster youth. We recently had a wellness session, how to care for your foster youth in isolation. During COVID-19, we're combating the isolation for our youth. We have to make sure they don't lose interest in our schools. We have to identify activities, virtual field trips, the thing that parents do for children, make sure that children remain engaged in their education. The critical components of this program: relationships, partnerships, individualized, academic support, and youth participation throughout each component. There's protocol for everything: selecting staff, placing staff at sites, and implementing the program. Program fidelity is the key to the success of this program. What we do is what our parents did for us. My father had us so captivated with education that I thought education in college was the 13th grade. and I thought it was mandatory. We do the same thing for our youth in foster care. Many of them tell us they didn't think college was an option for them. Program monitoring is what we also do. It's critical to ensure proper program implementation, and our external evaluation documents our success. 75% of our youth will improve in their academic progress, but our critical and most important statistic, we can provide you with more, but is the graduation rate. The reason we started this program was we're sure that 80 to 100% of our seniors will and do graduate from high school. This is an evidence-based educational support program, and it's received the Promising Practice designation from the Department of Education under the Obama administration. What that designation means is that if this program was replicated, they believe it could have made a systemic impact. We were one of the 15 innovation grant recipients nationally and received $3.5 million to replicate this model in Los Angeles. We're funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and every other foundation in California serving foster youth. Our agency seeks to train school districts and help others to implement this model because we know it works for not only foster youth, but youth on probation. Replication can eradicate, we believe, the underachievement of foster youth. These children are taken from their biological families because of abuse, neglect, and poverty and placed in a system that almost guarantees their future is dismal. From one system to a next, child dependency to the penal system to welfare to unemployment. But this program, as I conclude, it provides a proven strategy that if a committed person is involved in the life of a child and we have solid partnerships, that child can achieve academic success. My father, my hero, told me, you can always go back to college, but you can't always go back to high school. And we must take the education of foster youth seriously. It's my responsibility and everyone's responsibility, taking children away from their biological parents.
Thank you so much, Lydia. There is such a note of hopefulness in terms of having an approach that really is making a difference for some of the most marginalized children in our schools today in terms of ensuring their educational success. And it sounds like really from what you were saying, Lydia, and from what Megan was talking about in terms of children with disabilities, so much of that education success for marginalized children is having individualized attention, assessing what their individualized needs are, and then addressing them. One of the questions that I saw in the Q&A was related to English language learner students, which we haven't really talked a lot about yet. If any of the panelists would like to speak to any effective approaches on addressing the education needs of English language learner students or students with parents who are limited English proficient.
Well, we definitely do address English language learners in our program. That's critical. We have predominantly in the foster care system are African American and Latino youth. And so our staff is selected, as I shared earlier, about protocol. The protocol is intentional. We look at the student population being served, and we primarily, everything we have is in English and Spanish. And our staff reflects that diversity. And in implementing the program, we also assist our English language learners. Some of our programs and students are taught in both languages. So it's important, again, as I shared, and I think Megan shared, individual. This is not cookie cutter, and we assist the foster parents. We even have gone in and helped the foster parents in Spanish and English on how to make sure the hotspot is working, making sure they have the critical computers and making sure they have what's needed to support foster youth. And we have to do that in Spanish and in English. No one way is the response to serving foster youth or any population marginalized.
Thanks so much, Lydia. And I know, Abby and Adam, when you were talking about your report, you also had some bright spots of hope, some examples of success in addressing education of marginalized children, particularly in this COVID environment. Can you tell us a little bit about a couple of those examples?
Sure, and I'll first just start. So I think for one of the things that we recommend is that districts and schools increase their outreach to families and students, and that can be done via phone calls, text messages, a socially distanced in-person home visit. And so for students that come, whose second language is home language is not English and their parents' first language is not English, obviously wanting to have that be somebody at the school who can speak their home language, who can connect with them. And there are programs that help kind of provide models for that, like parent-teacher home visits program, and they have a lot of virtual strategies that you can use. And there are other school districts like Phoenix Union High School District in Arizona. They have an advisors for all approach. So every single student has an advisor. When it was in person, they were connecting daily with their advisor. And during the pandemic, they leveraged all the district staff to be able to conduct wellness check phone calls with the students. And they had a place to be able to document the phone calls, document needs, and kind of connections or referrals for community services or additional supports like access to Wi-Fi. A lot of states and districts do have programs for getting devices and things like that, but you need to first make the connection, identify the need.
Yeah, and just to second something that Lydia said, a lot of the report is about how we can use this as an opportunity to personalize instruction. I mean, Lydia kept saying it's not one size fits all. And the danger of moving to a virtual model is that there's only one curriculum or one set of activities that are put up there. But if we use this as an opportunity, if people are going to be in smaller classes anyway, if teachers are going to have a reduced number of students, then that can allow some more time for planning that personalization. And we're also seeing districts that are prioritizing in-person learning for English learners, for students with disabilities, for homeless and foster youth. And that's obviously still unfolding, but we know that those things can be done and we can put those students first.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Abby and Adam. Megan, any thoughts about any relationship between addressing compensatory education needs for children with disabilities and the issues of not having segregated services to the maximum extent possible for kids with disabilities or kids based on race or ability, that concern about segregation that's coming up, so how do you elevate the services that are needed for children who need more and still not segregate children?
I think that is a challenging question. I would say in our advocacy, we haven't limited our request for compensatory education to students with disabilities. We've actually said, we can identify that lots of marginalized student groups and even, some students that aren't marginalized have missed out on significant amounts of education during this time period. In the original discussions around what to do about that, in the late spring in California, at least, there was a discussion about having summer school for all students or after school programs for all students or, other kinds of resources like tutoring now that would be available for all students. So I think that's one solution that should be considered and is not going to create a segregated environment. I think on the other hand, there are, individual rights that students with disabilities have to specific services through their IEP that have been missed. And so that is going to require an individualized sort of response. I think, one concern as well is how we address the fact, like I said before, that some students are going to get that compensatory education through their IEP if they have an advocate or parent that knows to ask for this, and some aren't. So I would propose that there be some sort of, compensatory educational policy that would be put forth, like I said, a summer school or some other way of addressing this. Because even if you say that students should be able to get access individually and have that right for their IEP services that they missed, what are we going to do about all the students that don't ask for that? And there should be some sort of stopgap. So that's what I would recommend. But I also think, we can prioritize, for example, what Adam was talking about, having students that are high needs return to school earlier, or have like community resource centers that are available to those students, for example. And it doesn't have to be, only students with disabilities are here. It can be that the whole community accesses it, if it's in a community resource model. And if it's having students return to school earlier, who are high needs, it may not be, just students with disabilities, but you have all these different groups of students that would have access to that as well. So my hope is that, that wouldn't create segregation, but of course, I think we all need to be on notice of that. So I hope that sort of answered your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. And that's a tough question. I think everyone's struggling with it, but thank you. That was really helpful. I was wondering to follow up a little bit on Abby and Adam's comments about assessments. I think in many ways, even before COVID, assessment had become a 4-letter word. And yet, and there's so many differing opinions about particularly high stakes assessments. Obviously the teacher unions don't exactly love it. Some civil rights advocates like having some kind of benchmarking so that we know how poorly the systems are doing. Unfortunately, it often is used to further marginalize individual children rather than hold systems accountable. So what are you all recommending in terms of assessments in this crazy COVID environment?
So in our report, we point out states like New Hampshire that have done an innovative assessment pilot program where they're doing real-time, formative, ongoing assessment so that you don't have this high stakes model and that you have data kind of coming in to inform instruction regularly. And one of the things about going virtual is that it may actually be easier to have that kind of data because they're going to be submitting it online. And the days of writing down an exit slip, which is what I used to do, are gone. So that's what we talk about, and we talk a lot about a strengths-based approach to assessment, and not a focus on learning loss. A lot of the rhetoric right now is around learning loss. Students are learning at home. They're learning something. They're learning from their families and their communities and their relatives. And so we talk about it as instructional loss, and we talk about using assessment to target instruction, not as a means of treating students as like a problem to be solved.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And I think the focus on the systems problems, but solutions for the children, I think is a really good one. Throughout the discussion so far today, we've had a lot of discussion about technology and the fact that without access to both devices and internet, many children have been completely unable to participate in education, whether that's because they're in the delinquency system, whether that's because their families don't have access to it and can't get the devices from the school. I was wondering, Lydia, if you can talk a little bit more about ways that your program has tried to ensure that students who can learn through digital devices have that opportunity.
Well, through digital, let's first back up a minute on the children learning. And something Adam said earlier about individualized and the assessments. You have to have that connection with the youth for them to be involved with their own education. And that's the critical piece. So what we have done in distance learning is making sure our youth have all their tools. So it's like making sure they have the computers, making sure they have the hotspots, making sure they are comfortable with the online platforms. Everyone doesn't like to work in Zoom. Maybe there's Schoology. So we know all of the different platforms that are available, and it's individualized to that youth. Some youth may not want to meet you in Zoom today, so you use the telephone. That still works too. And so every youth, really, we tailor how we're providing the services to them in this new era of providing education. So distance learning still becomes an avenue in providing for your child. It's the same concept you would take as a mother, making sure that your child is remaining engaged, that they're participating, and that you know what the school is providing to them. We know what every teacher and every school is providing for our students. So that's why we're able to interact and engage with them and find out what's your best way to make sure you don't fall behind in school. And in those 2 weeks we talked about, and being able to make sure our program is up. When we were first learned we were closed, and then the week getting everyone on board, what we did so fast was to make sure we didn't lose one student. We didn't lose one student. And it was based, I believe, on that relationship. The relationship we have, that's critical. I can't say that enough. Being authentic first, because a lot of our children have been abandoned by by adults, and they've been mistreated. And so to see someone who's engaged in their lives and interested in their education holistically, every piece, not just the academic, that's pivotal.
Thank you, Lydia. That's really, really important. One question that came up in the chat was, there are obviously challenges in terms of the video technology approach that, you know, for a child who may be homeless, who may be in foster care, who may have a chaotic family environment, you know, having those attendance policies that are based on if you're not on video, you're not participating in the class. You know, how do we balance both the privacy issues related to that student's rights, and also how do we balance the issue of abuse and neglect that may be happening in the home and what is seen on Zoom? So anyway, I know that's a multifaceted question, but anyone who wants to pick up that one?
Adam, do you want to first pick up attendance and then?
Sure. So, I mean, I saw the question in the Q&A. It's a very difficult question to answer. And, you know, so as someone who personally experienced that as a youth, it weighs heavily on my mind. And I think what we talk about in the report is, you know, doing the best you can in terms of social workers, virtual home visits. But, you know, we know that's not going to be enough. So I think creating these safe spaces within the community that people can go to is going to be critical. And in terms of the attendance question, there's an organization called Attendance Works that provides a lot of resources around relying on engagement and wellness and social and emotional learning and supports. And states like Kentucky and California have redefined attendance for this school year. So that includes not only the time that students are logging in, but also the time equivalents for their work on assignments and assessments. So assessments or assignments can be worth a certain number of hours. So that takes the pressure off of youth from being on camera, especially if they're in an environment that's not safe.
Thank you. And Reggie, it looked like you might want to comment on some of the issues being discussed.
Well, you know, we've talked a bit here about the digital divide. I was off camera for a while so I could eat my lunch, but I've been with you the whole time, and you know, particularly where schools are going either partially or fully virtual, that has very serious implications for students who are in poverty. And I just don't know how you can solve that problem in any meaningful way. We came very near a strike here in Detroit public schools as a result of some pretty strong differences between the union and the administration of our largest public school district in the state of Michigan. Which also happens to be my client, where the general counsel is a former colleague here at my law firm. So it was very personal to try to figure out ways to address the concerns of the Detroit Federation of Teachers labor union to ensure that that they and their students would be safe. But in a community where there are we have a disproportionate number of children who are in poverty, the PPE issue and other issues can become quite serious. But again, due to the good faith work of a number of people, we were able to get our schools reopened. Not that all of the problems have been solved, but there's this sufficient understanding between the union and the district administration that these issues are going to have to be addressed during the course of the semester. This is real time. These are real time tough issues.
They are indeed. Another tough issue that was mentioned in the chat is related to kids with disabilities, particularly kids with autism, kids in need of speech language therapies, very hard to deliver, some of the physical therapies that are needed for some kids with disabilities. Any bright spots in terms of approaches that have been utilized to effectively deliver some of those specialized services during COVID?
Is that question for me?
Well, for anyone, actually, for anyone on the panel.
Yeah.
It's a tough one.
It is. It is. And, again, it's primarily about resources. There may be a will. What the question is if there's a way in many cases. Public education in Michigan has been somewhat balkanized in the sense that we've got traditional public schools, we've got charter schools, and then there are private schools, and there are very different circumstances in each of those categories, which creates a further division among those who are well-to-do and those who are not. Mm-hmm. So, and these problems are exacerbated by COVID. This is, it's going back to school, but the tagline is in the era of COVID, right? And that has, I think that exacerbates many of the issues that we've normally discussed with respect to the right to a quality education.
Absolutely, it certainly has. Megan?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I have necessarily some bright spots to share from my personal practice, but I'm sure they're out there. I just haven't seen a ton of it, although I will note that, we are here in LA have been, severely impacted by COVID-19. So there aren't as many in-person opportunities as you might have in other places. But I think this goes back to the point of why for certain students, prioritizing them for return to school earlier, even if just for that kind of service delivery would be really important to think about, because, those services are really challenging to provide remotely. We've seen that over time. And I think the other thing I would note is that some advocates have been successful in obtaining private getting folks to come to the home and then get reimbursement from the school districts for that. So that's an option for certain essential parts of the IEP that families can't do without for really high need students, especially those who need occupational therapy, behavioral support, things like that. I'd also go back to and note that in any of those cases, the parent shouldn't be expected to be implementing these services on their own without any support. So I would also recommend that's some part of a distance learning IEP include support for the parents on how to address these issues. So just a few things.
Thanks. That's really helpful. And, I think picking up on what Reggie said about resources, and I think Abby and Adam, your report also talks about resources as one of the key issues that needs to be addressed. Obviously, we know that there was the CARES Act funding. That was the first kind of piece of funding for K-12 education that came out of Congress. We were hoping there would be a second that would have gone through at least by early August, but that did not happen due to a stalemate in Congress. And so maybe Abby and Adam, is there something from your report related to resources that you might like to share? Because that is so foundational to schools being able to do what's needed.
Abby, do you want to take this, or would you?
Sure, I'll start. So first off, yeah, there is the CARES Act funding. Hopefully there will be more coming as well. And there's a lot of discretion in the use of the CARES Act funding for being strategic in investing in these services to support, the most vulnerable children who need additional support. So things that's related to the impact of COVID and anything that is, an authorized activity under ESSA, you can use those funds for. So I think as an advocate, I would point that out and kind of push back on districts or schools who are saying they don't necessarily have the resources for it. Also, the Governor Relief Fund can be used for a lot of these supports too. So I think making sure that the local and state government are making those strategic investments and prioritizing these areas where it's most important for supporting equitable learning opportunities is important. And then a fair number of things can be done without necessarily needing an added or new budgetary expense. Making sure that teachers are able to have time in the day to connect with students doesn't necessarily have an added cost to it. It's about how you prioritize time and schedules, and providing teachers with guidance and information to use so that those can be meaningful conversations, of which there are many freely available, and we compile and connect with a bunch of those in our report. So I think there are a lot of things that can be done that don't necessarily have added costs per se. And it's really just about, getting people to the resources. Mm-hmm. And there are definitely ones out there.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of the CARES Act funding has been spent by some districts, but it's important for people who aren't familiar with state budgets that, the big cuts are probably not going to happen for another year or 8 months when they go to the legislature again. So some states have even had increases that they were able to get through before, the tax revenues fell off. So we've looked at those across the state, and it's still very uncertain, like when those cuts are going to come and how that's going to play out across the state. And so districts can be creative. We know that districts may be dealing with, teacher resignations, and there's going to be a host of challenges recruiting people into the profession. And so we talk about, planning for that now, planning for grow your own programs, planning to invest in teacher retention and in teacher qualifications, and thinking long term, because states that have done that, like Rhode Island or California, they did that in the 2008 recession. And they really benefited compared to other states because they had that strategic long-term thinking.
That's great. Thank you, Abby and Adam. I know we're starting to get towards the end, and I just wanted to make sure that folks had a chance, each of our panelists had a chance to kind of add any concluding remarks that they feel either haven't been said yet or that they'd like to emphasize in terms of what's been said, that folks should take away from this in their, hopefully, advocacy for marginalized children and youth education in this time of COVID. So I'll do a reverse from our opening. So let me turn first to Lydia.
Thank you, Miriam. This is a social justice issue, and education really is a key to breaking the cycle of poverty. I think the opening remarks by Reginald were on point, awesome, and really speak to the injustices in education. And we must advocate for strategies and for approaches for foster youth and youth involved in delinquency. Every child needs a advocate, a youth education specialist, a mentor, a friend. And we must remember that if we want to prevent children from moving from one system to the penal system, educational strategies, we must invest in them, because I think and know that they do work and they make a difference. It is a key to breaking the cycle of poverty and a key to our children being successful. We can do this. I know we can do this. And I'll be quiet,
Yes.
Miriam, because I can talk forever on foster youth.
I don't want you to be quiet, Lydia. Amen is all I can say. Hallelujah, sister, I'm with you. Okay. Next. Oh, go ahead, Reginald.
I just want to say thank you for your kind words, Lydia. I can learn a lot from you, and I look forward to continuing this conversation as we move forward.
Great, thank you.
I look forward to talking with you. Thank you so much.
And Megan, final thoughts to leave folks with.
Yeah, so I have been speaking to my law students and myself to try to give myself some positive outlook on all of this, because I think, right now it's easy for us to get caught up in all of the enormous challenges facing, the country, our young people, ourselves. But I think what I would like to say is for us to use this as an opportunity to rethink some parts of the education system that haven't been working for a long time for our young people, especially, I'll talk about my clients, why so many of them end up in the juvenile justice system. My clients have to change schools all the time. I'm sure Lydia could talk about this as well, but when young people have to change schools because they're either, pushed out of school, or they change homes, they have housing instability, or they're involved in the foster care system and they're made to change schools, that really is challenging for them. It makes a huge difference to increase school stability for all students. And then I would say, along with that, we need to end the school to prison pipeline, school to prison track, whatever you want to call it. I would advocate to remove police presence from schools and invest instead in mental health services and nursing supports, special education services, early intervention for students. So many of my clients come to me, high school, incarcerated, juvenile detention facilities, have never been assessed for special education. I get them and I identify a learning disability that's been there since they were a little kid. So those things are really, really important. And when a kid who has a learning disability and hates school because they have a learning disability starts to act out as a high school student, we have a police officer there to take them out and remove them from school, what we get is kids incarcerated and then continuing this system. So those are some things that I would note. I'd also say, something that's really, really important, what we can take away as a positive is how key technology can be for all students and families, and how we need to bridge the digital divide, not just now in COVID-19, but beyond this. So, I think it should be a long-term commitment. It should be part of what we determine is important for our schools to work with communities to increase technology access for students, but also for their families and communities as well. And I saw some questions in the chat. How do we make sure that, families don't have to pay back for those devices? Really, we should be seeing this as an investment, as a taxpayer investment, and saying they're putting in that money, and we should be giving them these devices so that they can access. We don't want to continue to make people to somehow involve the justice system by making these devices something that is something that families are afraid to take because they're worried they might get stolen or broken or held accountable in some other way. So we should really take this as an opportunity to increase technology access, but not do so in a way that harms low-income people and those that are high needs in our communities. So I'll stop there, but those are some things I'd like to conclude with.
Thank you so much, Megan. And yes, if anyone's interested in the issues of police in schools, the Education Civil Rights Alliance just did a fact sheet together with AFT on that issue. It's on our website. So Adam, final concluding thoughts.
Sure. I think that a lot of what Lydia talked about and how important relationships are in her program is what gives me grounds for optimism, which is what Megan talked about. Because it's really hard to have an interpersonal relationship and make sure that every child has an adult in the building who's looking out for them when you have 125 kids and 8 classes and the regular business of school. So now that that is not happening in most places, I'm optimistic that we'll figure out structures and we provide and report some ways to do that where every child will have an advocate in the building, even if there isn't a building. And I think that's the most positive outcome that we could see from this pandemic.
Amen. Thank you, Adam. Abby?
Yes, I think just somewhat echoing the sentiments here, business as usual in education is over, and that's not necessarily a bad thing for the vast majority of students. Our education system was crafted over a century ago, and it does not meet the needs of current students, nor is it based upon what we know from research on effective teaching and learning, what really works. So in this opportunity and moment of upheaval, there's this opportunity to seize the moment and let's make these shifts that have been really hard to do before because there wasn't this opportunity of disruption. So disruption isn't bad when things weren't working already. And so I think that's what we really are trying to frame, seizing the moment, taking this opportunity, making short-term changes that are responsive to the current moment, but also put schools and districts and states on a better path for a more equitable system, and putting in these things that can be long-standing as well. So some of these short-term changes meet the moment and should stay in place. Like having smaller groups and smaller stable communities, creating more time for teacher planning and professional development and connecting with students and families. But then there are also things that, steps can be taken towards in a really long view, like more equitable funding formulas, like preparing educators and the pipeline of having educators. And also just to reiterate on the restorative practices front, I think, as a lot of schools are considering eliminating the presence of police in schools, we just really want to hammer home that shouldn't be in a vacuum, that there needs to be services, counseling, mental health supports, and restorative practices that are put in their place. So we want to not just take it away, but put in all those things that there's accumulating evidence that shows that shifting to restorative practices reduces the use of exclusionary discipline, also reducing disproportionality in that discipline and discrimination, and then also makes schools safer, better school climate, and better overall outcomes. So there's research to point to, and there are lots of resources out there with what you can do. I know that restorative practices, the risk is saying it without, all the pieces of what that really means and takes, but there are lots of things out there that go into more detail. We link to, I'm sure in your fact sheet, you connect folks with resources on how they can put this into place in schools. And there are places that are doing it, have done it, and have shown good results.
Absolutely. Yes, and that is definitely the conclusion of our Police in Schools paper as well. Thanks so much, Abby. Reggie, I want to give you a chance for final comment.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I really appreciate the really hard work that all of you are doing to help improve our education system, particularly for those who are often referred to as the least of these. And I'm grateful to be a part of the American Bar Association because of the wonderful work you do.
Thank you so much, Reggie. Really appreciate it. And I want to thank everyone who joined us for this webinar. We had over 300 folks, I think, at its height. So very, very happy for all of you to have joined us. And I want to in particular thank our wonderful panelists. You all are doing such great and important work and really helped share some important perspectives on this very, very important issue at this very, very challenging time. So thank you so much. The one concluding comment, this section of Civil Rights and Social Justice provides free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide. We hope that this helps you in your work. And again, if you can, please consider joining and becoming active in the ABA, and you may do so at ambar.org/CRSJ. You can find information on other free programs on the CRSJ webpage. And I want to thank you all again and say stay safe, stay healthy, and please keep fighting for education equity.